Okay, so this is the recording for the digestive system, chapter 26, and let's begin by talking about some basic functions of the digestive system. So I have here a tube that's going to represent the digestive system, and the top will be the mouth. The first function of the digestive system is, of course, ingestion. That's just taking in food or water. That food or water is then digested, which is the second function of the digestive system, and there are two forms of digestion. There's chemical digestion by enzymes, and then there's mechanical digestion. So in the mouth, that is from the muscles of the tongue and also the teeth that are actually breaking down the food. The third function of the digestive system is motility. So that's moving the food and then the bolus down the digestive system through things like peristalsis. The fourth function of the digestive system would be secretion. So that's like from accessory organs like the pancreas or the liver, and from the wall of the digestive tract. So remember, the digestive tract is lined by epithelial cells that will secrete things into the digestive system, as well as the liver and the pancreas. So that brings us to the fifth one, absorption. And this is really the name of the game of the digestive system. That's to take the nutrients and absorb them into the blood. And then finally, the sixth main function of the digestive system is elimination. So that would be just getting rid of what is left in the digestive system through the anus. Okay, so we have 6 main functions of the digestive system, and we'll look at each one of these as we move throughout the chapter. So before we move on, let's take a look at some generalized histology of the digestive tract. So on the outer ring, we have layers of smooth muscle that help with motility and also mechanical digestion. So, for instance, in the stomach, we have 3 layers of smooth muscle that churn and mix the food. Then we have the layer of epithelial cells that aid in secretions. And then we have a layer of mucus that lubricates the food and also protects the lining of the digestive tract. So again, this is just a generalized histology of the digestive system. I know you went into more detail into lab and the specific sections, but we'll look at some of those as we move throughout the chapter. Okay, so let's start here at the mouth. We begin with mechanical digestion, and that's called mastication or chewing. Sorry, my dog is snoring. We also have salivary glands here. We have the sublingual, which is underneath the tongue here. We have the submandibular, which is underneath the mandible. And then we also have the parotid, which is right back here, the biggest of the salivary glands, and they make saliva. In the mouth, we have the first instance of chemical digestion. The saliva contains salivary amylase. which begins the digestion of carbohydrates, specifically starches. I have a picture here of the teeth, which I'm going to redraw for you. I feel like the teeth get sort of the short end of the stick and don't get proper explanation. So the teeth are super important. They help with the lifespan of a human being. Actually, elephants will live extremely long, and this is due to the fact that their teeth regrow as they age. So elephants live extremely long, and that is because their teeth will actually replace themselves, allowing them to continue to eat the mass amounts of vegetation required to maintain their large bodies. So in essence, just your teeth, the health of your teeth are super important for your overall health. So your teeth are broken down in basically 4 quadrants: the top and bottom, and the left and the right. They begin with 2 sets of incisors. So these are your incisors. And then we have 1 canine. Those are the pointy teeth, or your vampire-looking teeth that help us to tear into food. These are the canines. Then we have 2 premolars per quadrant. So your premolars, or your baby molars, sometimes they're called. And then you also have 3 molars in each quadrant. So these are your molars. And the last molar is often referred to as the wisdom tooth. So this is often referred to as the wisdom tooth, which is usually removed from the mouth to make room for the rest of your teeth. Okay, so these are your teeth. Make sure that you know how many sets of each that you have. All right, so after the mouth we have chemical and mechanical digestion there. The food begins to move down the esophagus. And here it becomes a bolus. So the act of swallowing is called deglutination. And this bolus has helped to move down the esophagus and then into the stomach through peristalsis, which is involuntary contraction of smooth muscle. So involuntary contraction of smooth muscle is called peristalsis. The phases of swallowing are important to note. The voluntary phase happens in the oral cavity. And is due to skeletal muscle, which makes it voluntary. Then as it reaches the pharynx, the parts of the pharynx, it's called the pharyngeal phase, which is involuntary. And it's between the uvula, which is that hangy ball in the back of your throat, so right here, the uvula, and the epiglottis. So the pharynx is between the uvula and the epiglottis. And then we have the esophageal phase, which is also involuntary. And what makes these phases involuntary is the fact that they're due to smooth muscle, which occurs due to peristalsis. And this peristalsis moves this bolus along past this cardial sphincter into the stomach. And remember, here we have 3 layers of smooth muscle: transverse, oblique, it's circular, oblique, and longitudinal. Circular, oblique, and longitudinal. And those 3 layers help to mix and churn this bolus into chyme. We also have secretions here from the stomach. The stomach mixes food, content and also secretes hydrochloric acid, mucus, and pepsin. And then we'll also talk about gastrin later on. But as this bolus, which turns into chyme, moves past this pyloric sphincter, it's now called chyme. It is now in the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. And in the duodenum, in the small intestine, is where the majority of digestion and absorption actually occurs. We can't do this without the help, of course, of our accessory organs. So what are our accessory organs? Our accessory organs are, of course, the salivary glands, but also the liver and the pancreas. So here is our chyme entering into the duodenum. Our liver is making bile, which will be released from the gallbladder. It makes its way from the common bile duct into the small intestine whenever there's the presence of fats in the small intestine. And then the pancreas. The pancreas secretes many different digestive enzymes. Such as, let's list them here, lipase, that helps digest fats, pancreatic amylase, helping to digest carbohydrates, and trypsin, which helps to digest proteins. We also have secretions here from our brush border cells. So these enzymes are brush border enzymes that help to further digest the chyme into smaller sections. So these enzymes are things like maltase, sucrase, lactase, and also peptidase. They're breaking these digestive particles into smaller bits so that they can then move into the bloodstream. So what makes it into the lymphatic system and what makes it into the bloodstream? Our monosaccharides, like glucose, make it into the bloodstream. Our amino acid short chains make it in, which are broken down from proteins, make it into the bloodstream. But our leftover fats make it into the lymphatic system, and they're in the form of fatty acid chains and glycerol. Fatty acid chains and glycerol. Okay. So what about in the colon? So here's the last part of the small intestine, the ileum. And we have some non-digested particles. They pass the ileocecal valve, into the first part of the colon, called the cecum, where there is bacteria. And this bacteria undergoes, or these non-digested particles undergo fermentation. With the aid of bacteria that is naturally found in the colon to help digest these non-digestible particles into something more manageable. They can help to produce shorter fatty acid chains, shorter carbohydrates, shorter proteins, so shorter chains of amino acids. They can also help produce certain vitamins like vitamin K and vitamin Bs, your vitamin Bs. Another structure that's worth mentioning is the appendix. It's sort of a ligament type structure and probably has some role in the immune system. But the main function of the colon is actually to absorb water and ions. Water and ions. So the actual epithelium of the colon is geared for this and has gobs of goblet cells that will actually secrete lots of mucus because you're pulling so much water out of the non-digested material that it needs help to move through the rest of the digestive tract. Now let's talk about some physiology. Okay, so the salivary glands secrete saliva. And remember, this is exocrine secretion because it moves through a duct and then directly into the target tissue, which is the mouth. Saliva acts to moisten, cleanse the mouth, allows for taste, and also begins chemical digestion with the secretion of salivary amylase, which helps to start digesting starch, which is a carbohydrate, a complex carbohydrate. So we have the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx, which makes up total the pharynx, which acts to move particles of food towards the esophagus. And right here we have a picture of the esophagus, and what allows food to move to the esophagus down this way towards the stomach instead of going down the trachea towards the lungs is the fact that we have the structure called the epiglottis. When we swallow, it closes sort of like a toilet seat over the trachea and keeps food from moving down into the trachea, into the lungs. If we were to do this, it would cause what's known as an aspiration, and particles of food and whatever could get trapped in the lungs and cause pneumonia or some sort of infection. All right, so as food moves down the esophagus, it becomes a bolus and then into the stomach. And the stomach secretes mucus, hydrochloric acid, and pepsinogen. All right. So now let's talk about stomach secretions. We just listed those off. The stomach secretes mucus, which is made by the mucous neck cells. It also secretes pepsinogen, which comes from the chief cells. We have hydrochloric acid that comes from the parietal cells. And then we also have these epithelial cells that line the lumen of the stomach. So now we have the bolus here traveling from the esophagus past this cardiac sphincter. And in the stomach, it mixes and churns. We get acid secretion that helps to digest the bolus. And then it'll move past the pyloric sphincter. And now it's become chyme. So the process we see here is it goes from being a bolus, it churns in the stomach, thanks to those 3 layers of muscle in the stomach. It goes through hydrolysis. And it does this by means of pepsinogen, being activated by hydrochloric acid so that it can become pepsin. And pepsin is what actually helps to digest proteins in the stomach. All right? And the stomach can totally hold about 2 to 4 liters of fluid and food that we've eaten. So now that bolus has become chyme. All right. And hydrolysis is the breaking of the peptide bonds between amino acids. So here's one amino acid, and here's another amino acid, and there's a peptide bond there, and hydrolysis acts to break apart this bond here, breaking apart proteins. And that's what happens in the stomach. Okay, so far in the mouth we've had carbohydrate digestion, specifically starch. In the stomach we've had protein digestion by pepsin. And so now let's see what happens in the small intestine. In the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, is where we see the majority of digestion occurring. So the most digestion occurs in the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. In the jejunum is where we see the majority of absorption. In the ileum, we don't have really the most digestion or the most absorption happening here, but we do have some important absorption of vitamins like vitamin D and vitamin K. Okay, and then from the ileum we go into the large intestine or the colon. Excuse me. So what other secretions are we seeing here in the small intestine that help with digestion? We get cholecystokinin, or CCK, which is secreted in the small intestine whenever there is fats that enter, whenever there's fats present in the chyme. And this CCK stimulates the gallbladder, stimulates contraction of the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is holding bile made by the liver. And so it says, gallbladder, release your bile into the duodenum. And this helps to digest fats. Okay. So who all aids in digestion in the duodenum? Well, the stomach is adding chyme and hydrochloric acid. The liver, the gallbladder, is adding bile to help digest fats. The pancreas is adding its pancreatic enzymes. But we also have these brush border enzymes coming from our brush border cells, and these are found on the lining of the small intestine. So I have here a picture of the lumen of the small intestine, and it's coated or it's lined in these villi. And on those villi we have microvilli. And this aims to increase surface area to add in digestion and absorption. And on these microvilli are these brush border cells that make these brush border enzymes that also help in further digestion of the chyme. Okay, so now let's talk about the liver and the liver's blood supply. Blood supply to the liver is coming from the portal Sorry, this is actually supposed to be proper right here. The proper hepatic artery that supplies oxygen to the liver. The portal vein, which is super nutrient rich. And then the hepatic vein, which is nutrient and actually oxygen poor. It carries all the blood out of the liver. So the liver is made up of these liver lobules. And within these liver lobules, we find the portal triad. And what makes up the portal triad? So in between these liver lobules, we have the portal triad, and there's three structures that make up the portal triad. Let me draw these in here. So these little dots here are going to represent the vessels. So in green, we have the common hepatic duct. In blue, that would represent the portal vein. And then here in pink, that would be the proper hepatic artery. And they're in between these liver lobules, carrying nutrients in and away from the liver. And in between, or inside these liver lobules, we have a central artery. Okay, so these liver lobules then are made up of the epithelium of the liver, which we call hepatocytes. All right, so that's some histology of the liver. So make sure that you know what makes up the portal triad. All right, what about the pancreas? What's being added by the pancreas? We know the liver is making bile, it's being held in the gallbladder, and then eventually it gets secreted into the duodenum whenever there's fat present in the chyme. But the pancreas is secreting pancreatic juice or pancreatic enzymes, and these are bicarbonate, which neutralizes the hydrochloric acid coming from the stomach. We get pancreatic amylase that helps to digest the carbs. We get lipase, it helps to digest fats, and we also get nuclease, helps to digest nucleotides, and then also other zymogens, which are inactive enzymes. Okay, so what is digested in the duodenum? So in the mouth, we were digesting starch. In the stomach, we were digesting proteins. But what about in the duodenum? We said that the most digestion occurs here. So let's list these out. We get protein digestion. So breaking apart amino acids. Who does this? Brush border enzymes from our brush border cells. The pancreas helps and digest proteins. What about carbohydrates? Well, also our brush border enzymes help to digest carbohydrates as well as the pancreas. Nucleotides. Brush border enzymes help to digest nucleotides. What about fats? Well, of course, the pancreas with its lipase, but also the liver/gallbladder with its bile. Okay, so keep those in mind where certain dietary molecules are being digested. Now the liver's role in digestion. So the liver's role is metabolism, which is catabolism, the breaking down of molecules and anabolism, building them up. It also aims for storage, so carbohydrates. It stores carbohydrates as glycogen. Fats, it stores them as lipoproteins. So those are like your HDLs, your LDLs, and also your chylomicrons. Triglycerides. And also your proteins. And it processes these and turns them into things like albumin, your plasma proteins that we use to maintain osmotic pressure. These right here can all be used for energy. Okay. The liver, it does metabolism, storage, but it also does detox. Specifically with this molecule, this enzyme called cytochrome P450. Cytochrome P450. And it's an enzyme that is super non-specific. So it's not specific, but it will react with a lot of different things. So what it does is that it helps to detoxify toxins by pulling them out of the blood that is running through the liver. But this, in turn, this also makes drugs that you're taking less efficient. So you have to consider this whenever you're calculating the dosage of things that get cleared by the liver. So it decreases drug efficiency. It also makes bile, so it produces bile, which aids in the absorption of fats. So liver's role is metabolism, storage, detox, and also bile production. What's the pancreas's role? Well, one of them is exocrine. We've talked about the endocrine role, which is the making of insulin and glucagon, but its exocrine role is to make salts and enzymes. And these are then secreted into the duodenum. Okay, I won't go over this because we just did this part. And how are these molecules actually absorbed once they're digested in the small intestine? So then most of this, keep in mind, will be happening in the duodenum, the second part of the small intestine. All right, so proteins that have been broken down into smaller amino acids, how do they get into the bloodstream? And this is mainly by primary active transport. Okay, so these amino acids will utilize certain transporters that need ATP because it's an active transport. And make its way into the blood. What about sugar or carbohydrates? Specifically monosaccharides, so single sugars. Well, they use a secondary active transport. They also will use certain transporters on these epithelial cells that lie in the jejunum. And we'll use sodium in this case. So they utilize sodium in that it's going to move down its concentration gradient, and sugar hitches a ride. So now we have this sugar inside of the cell, and then sugar again moves down its concentration gradient, allowing sugar to move or catch a ride with it. So now we can have sugar in the blood. Okay. What about nucleotides? They also use primary active transport. And then fats. Fats basically will diffuse, but they take a little bit different of a route. Whenever they get into the interstitial space, excuse me, they form these spherical-like structures called chylomicrons that are actually too big to be taken in or moved through the capillaries. So they're taken in through the lymphatic system first. And then the lymphatic system will empty into the bloodstream. Okay? So now let's go over the steps that bile takes before it reaches the duodenum. Okay, so first step is that bile is made in the liver. It then moves down the structure called the common hepatic duct. It makes its way into the cystic duct. So that would be the cystic duct. It's stored in the gallbladder. So that would be number 4. And whenever there is fat in the duodenum, there's a release of the enzyme CCK, or cholecystokinin, that causes the gallbladder to contract. And then bile makes its way back out through the cystic duct. So that will be number 5. Down the common bile duct. That'll be number 6. And then finally into the duodenum, where it will emulsify fats, basically opening up fats so that enzymes like lipase can come in and break those fats apart. So now what happens to that bile? It makes its way to the ileum, the last section of the small intestine, and is in the form of bile salts, it says fats right there. And which one of these is actually absorbed? Well, the fats we get absorbed, but these bile salts will make its way back to the liver, where they are recycled and reused to make more bile. So that will be number 9. Okay, so the fats are absorbed, but the bile salts are recycled and sent back to the liver, where they can be reused to make more bile. All right, so those are the steps in which bile is made and then used in the duodenum. Okay, the large intestine, or the colon. So the first section of the large intestine is the cecum. So we've passed from the ileum, past the ileocecal valve, and now into the cecum. This is the appendix. Of the ascending across the transverse, down the descending through the sigmoid and then the rectum. The role of the large intestine is basically absorption, and we absorb tons of water here. Too little absorption of water and we get diarrhea. Too much and we get constipation. We're also absorbing inorganic ions like sodium and potassium chloride. We also have natural organisms. And I mean natural flora, so stuff that is supposed to be there. So bacteria that is supposed to be there. And these microorganisms help to digest carbs, fats, stuff that has not digested in the small intestine. So it helps to digest these into smaller, more manageable pieces. And byproducts of this are sometimes methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions. They also will help to produce vitamins, B vitamins, vitamin K, which are then absorbed into the bloodstream. So the rectum itself is important for storage. And then it makes its way into the anus. And there are some important structures of the anus that we should all be pretty thankful for. And that's the internal anal sphincter and the external anal sphincter. So it's made up of muscle. The internal is smooth muscle, meaning it's under involuntary control. So it's what lets us know that we actually have to eliminate waste, where the external anal sphincter is made up of skeletal muscle, which allows us to hold our waste until we're at the proper place to actually use the restroom. Okay, so keep that in mind. Know which ones are made up of what type of muscle. So control of digestion. The first part of this is the cephalic digestion. And that's whenever we sense or smell food, it triggers something in our brain that then sends it down to the stomach. It makes our stomach start to gurgle and lets us know that, hey man, that smells really good and maybe we are hungry. So it's a cephalic phase. And then starts the hormonal control of digestion, and that's the gastric phase, when we actually have food in our stomach. Okay, we get this release of gastrin from the stomach, and gastrin acts to secrete hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. This in turn will increase stomach motility, making the stomach move and churn more because there's obviously food there. And then we get chyme in the stomach. Chyme in the duodenum, sorry. And we are no longer in the gastric phase. This would be considered the intestinal phase. So, intestinal phase. Once we have chyme in the duodenum, there are fats present. We get a release of the hormone CCK, or cholecystokinin, that will trigger the gallbladder to contract and release bile so that we can emulsify fats and begin to digest them. It will also, chyme in the duodenum will also trigger release of pancreatic enzymes. Another hormone is secretin. This triggers a release of bicarbonate solution, which its aim is to reduce or neutralize the acid, the hydrochloric acid that's coming from the stomach. So we don't want that acid in the duodenum that would eat away at the walls of the duodenum. So we need something to neutralize this acid, and it comes from the pancreas, and that's this bicarbonate solution. Okay, other things these enzymes do. CCK actually slows down the motility of the stomach, as well as secretin inhibits the motility of the stomach. So once we have enough chyme in the small intestine, the release of those hormones actually slows the motility down of the stomach so that we can have time to digest the chyme that is now in the small intestine. Okay. So all in all, just so that we're clear, it's the fats in the chyme that causes the release of the CCK to be released, and it's the acidity from the hydrochloric acid that causes the secretin to be released. Okay. So now just a little review over some of the diseases. It's the last part I really want to go over. And celiac disease is genetically linked. It's seen often with other diseases like type 1 diabetes and thyroid disorder. The thyroid disease. And it's more common in people with Down syndrome. Celiac is found in populations in more developed countries, and the numbers for that are 1 for every 70 to 300 people. So that would be like in North America and Europe, so more developed countries. It's not very prevalent in less developed countries. So these numbers are particular for, say, North America and Europe. Okay, so what is the problem with celiac disease? Well, it's an autoimmune disorder that is sensitive to gluten. But what is gluten? Gluten's made up of gliadin and glutenin. And since celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder, we're making antibodies against something. And these antibodies are attacking the gliadin of this gluten. And when we produce antibodies, we get inflammation. And the inflammation in the walls of our intestines will, in turn, decrease absorption. So people with celiac disorder will have a decrease in the absorption of water, so they're often really dehydrated, decrease in fats, absorption of fats, and even iron and vitamin B12. Okay. Here's a picture of the wall of an intestine that somebody has with celiac disease. And we can see that, with a normal intestine, we have all of this surface area with all of these villi and microvilli able to, digest and absorb things. But with celiac disease, it's filled with all these inflammatory cells inhibiting absorption. Okay, so that concludes the digestive video for today. That's chapter 26. I hope it helps in furthering your studying. So good luck.